collaborating with government, where government would sort of slip them a rubber-stamped piece of paper that says this email address, this user, this person here, we want everything that's on your servers, and they would make a perfect copy from their servers and they would pass it to the government, and no one would be the wiser. The person who had been subject to this surveillance wouldn't even be notified. They wouldn't get a chance to contest it in court. But the core here is, as much as the government was doing, as much as this intrusive capability was being constructed and carried out, we were creating for the first time perfect records of private lives at a scale that had never been done before. It was leading to something greater, which is to what we see today. The government power and the corporate power were not separate institutions that were working to their own ends. They were, in fact, melding together into something entirely new. And it is this collaboration between corporate and government power that we have seen today emerge into something quite unexpected, I think, which is actually governments have such an appetite for the capabilities and the information, the data that these companies hold on individuals, that governments are beginning to become clients to corporations. Governments are, in a unusual way, beginning to be subordinate to these companies in a way that I think would have been quite difficult to predict. And this has emboldened the companies. They understand now the appetites of government for this information, and they understand how much power, how much influence, how much money can be had if they have something that no one else can provide. And so what we have seen over the last decade is a race to see who can know the most about the most people, know the most about the most. And this is what we struggle with today. So again, it raises the question, all right, so what do we do about it? Well, the first thing is we have to look at this and go, is this okay? We are told this is right and proper. We are told that, look, we can't do anything in court about this because it's not our records. Even if the data is about you, even if it's your messages, they say, well, these things belong to the companies. They're the company's records. They're on the company's servers. But nobody at the company created that record. You created that record. It's your activities. And our laws have not been updated to address this. There is a fundamental issue that is unresolved in privacy law around the world today, which is there is no universally recognized ownership right of data about you. Data that is created about you, data that's held about you, data that's processed about you. They say it's not yours. And I think that's incorrect. I think if we change that, and this is a simple legal reform that only needs to be done in one major jurisdiction, and then all the technology companies will have to rejigger their systems, and basically it'll be a global reform even if it happens in one major jurisdiction. Because you can't you can't ignore that change. Technically, if a user has to have the ability to go, you can't use that way, or you can't keep that, or you can't track me, I don't agree with that, then suddenly everything will change. Right now, the problem is today it's unimaginable for a lot of people. There's this popular thing that, like, oh, people don't care. It doesn't matter to people. And I've been talking to people about this for years in every country and every platform you can imagine. And people do care. People are furious about what's being done. The thing is, they feel like they can't do anything about it. They have been disempowered to the point that they feel like they have no more influence over their own governments, over their own policies, over this system that increasingly rules them, rather than is something that they are partnered to and part of in this process. And I think once we realize that, collectively, change will happen very quickly.
RSF's report says that this is the decisive decade for journalism, and your own life and the risks, the sacrifices you've made. You're living in Russia instead of in the United States. You can't go back. You could get arrested. You would get arrested if you went back to the US. These sacrifices that you've made to live by, to be a whistleblower, this seems to be what this decade is going to demand. Uh, what advice would you give to journalists, people who want to get the truth out?
Yeah, look, I spoke once with a very senior journalist who wrote it, one of these journalism reviews. And she told me something, and I was, quite early on in my notoriety here, and had very much, I did trust journalists and the institution of journalism to play their role, and I think they played it well in my case. But she said the more that she knows journalists, the less that she likes them. And coming from someone who had worked in journalism, I thought this was a crazy thing, and it was because she felt that they were becoming cynical. And I actually agree with her to an extent there. But as I've spent more years, this happened more than 5 years ago, I think. I've realized that it's not journalists; it's all of us. We feel like we know everything. That little Google search box, the accessibility of information, allows us to pull up any argument to support our own pre-existing, cognitive biases. But how does that change? Somebody out there, somewhere, cares enough to make the argument that no, actually, all of you are wrong. You think you understand what's happening, but actually you look at this, and this, and this, and this, and what do you think now? And I think that's really the heart of journalism. And I think that's what it takes to change this. We talk about blowing the whistle, we talk about the sacrifices that I made. There were over 30,000 people working at the NSA. Not all of them knew what I did, but there were plenty of people who should have known or could have known, and they could have done something, and they didn't. For me, it wasn't about, standing up and saving the world. I haven't saved the world, and I don't think that one person can, but what we can do is we can make it better, one step at a time. We can do something for ourselves, for our families, for our communities, to say, look, I know you think that, but I have seen evidence that actually something very different is happening, and I think it's alarming, and I think we should do something about it. I think we should reconsider the path that we're on. And that's what this is. We talked about this feeling of disempowerment. Whether you're a journalist, whether you're an ordinary person, the world is facing an extraordinary slate of threats on basically every axis of progress. We are at the beginning of an age of regression if we do nothing. But progress can be sustained, and the way we do that is we recognize that, people talk about reform and this potential to fix things, and they think, well, if we just wait, eventually they'll wake up and things will get better, the people in charge. But power doesn't listen. Power only responds. Reform only occurs if it is pushed upon institutions. It is something that is willed into existence by a collective civil ideal. And there is no class in the world that is more capable of developing that kind of popular consensus than journalists. And I think when we look at this, particularly for those who've been in journalism for a while, who are feeling that cynicism, is go, look, you're right, the world is in a tough place, but it's only going to get better one way, and that's with you. Yeah, you can start and make a difference one way. You can stand up, you can blow the whistle, you can, whistleblowing isn't about who you are. It's not about your skill set. It's about what you can prove. It's about what you've seen. And this is what I think journalists are good at. And this is what everybody has a role in, wherever you work in your office, whether you work for the government, whether you work for the company, whether you work, at a convenience store. If you see something that matters, and we all see things that matter in different parts of our lives, and you say, I can't ignore this, that's the beginning of something more. Tell somebody about it. Persuade them as best you can that this is something worth considering, and see if they agree with you. And if they do, you tell somebody else, you tell somebody else. Reform is a process that starts with you, but it does not end with you. We have to stop thinking in these binary terms where either we save the world or the world saves itself, but there's nothing we can do. Either we do everything or we do nothing. No, all we have to do is enough. And enough is a very little amount, but it's more than nothing. And I think if we start, we'll make things better.
There's a point, though, in your life where you stood up and you developed the courage to stand up and say, this is wrong. And that's kind of what journalists have to go through now against power, right? It's gotten much harder, and every person reaches that point, and many people back down.
Yeah.
What is that point? How do you push more people to have the courage to do that? Like, what went through your head? Why did you decide to do it?
The thing for me was I looked at the trend, and I remembered the internet of my youth. I remember what it used to be like to be anyone, to be no one, and to just say what you thought. You could be incredibly wrong. You could say something incredibly stupid, or you could say something crushingly honest, but might have been embarrassing, or it might have been painful if it was linked to your personal identity. But no one remembered. They said nowadays they say the internet never forgets. But back then the internet forgot immediately because nobody cared and nobody knew who you were. We picked our own names, and the names changed every week. And as we saw the early creative and cooperative internet be replaced by an increasingly commercial and competitive internet, as the means of communication became a mechanism for profit, and as governments began to use it as a platform for predation, and to be able to basically look at everyone and pull anyone off the board, know all of their secrets, do everything like that. I thought, well, what is the world going to look like? What is tomorrow going to look like if I do nothing? What if nobody knows about this just because people like me never say anything about it until it's too late? Because the longer these powers exist, the longer these systems are allowed to entrench themselves in the operations of these institutions, the harder they are to change, the harder they are to roll back. And honestly, one of the greatest criticisms I have of myself is that I waited far too long. But I think for everyone else, particularly journalists, there are a lot of journalists, I think, who keep their head down, and they're doing so rationally. They are looking at the attacks against journalists today. They are looking at the rising tide of hate-mongering from officials in many different countries. The intentional targeting that does, in many cases, result in violence. And they go, look, I've got bills, I've got a family, or I just want to get to the end of the day and watch my shows. They go, this is not for me, I can't fix it on my own. But when you think about what happens if you do nothing, and you think about what that means for your family, you think about what that means for the world that you are going to have to live in along with everyone else. And then you consider just for a moment what the alternative might be if you took a risk. Because it's not enough to believe in something. It's not enough to believe that things have to change. It's not enough to believe that we need reform. You have to stand for something if you want something to change. And I think we see extraordinarily brave journalists. We see extraordinarily brave people in every occupation today, because crisis and tragedy, as terrible as they are, they have a way, I believe, in bringing out the best in individuals. But I don't want people to think, this is something that happens without sacrifice. You don't have to light yourself on fire, but you can't just sit on the couch and wait for things to get better. It really does start with you.
Fantastic. Thank you. My gosh. Those are great words of advice. And there does come a moment when you have to stand up. This is where journalism is headed in the decade of crisis that we're living through. Edward, it is so good to speak with you again. We're going to hear again from Joseph Stiglitz, from Rana Ayub, from Christophe Deloire, the Secretary General of RSF. I'm Maria Ressa. See you again soon.
Thank you so much. It was good to be with you, Maria. Stay free.